Well, good afternoon and welcome back to the hot seat. Today I'm speaking with Amy Blackwell, who's an impact advisor at Acorn Capital. Good afternoon and welcome, Amy.
Hi, thank you for having me. I look forward to a conversation.
Fantastic. For PCD members who perhaps aren't familiar with the work of an impact advisor, could you explain a little bit more about what it is and the value of working with one?
Sure. An impact advisor really comes into a family to help them create a more dynamic and bespoke strategy. And so what we do is we look at the values within the family, and we identify what would they really like to achieve in the long term. And then we work backwards. So what we do is, look at the change we'd like to see, look at the stakeholders who would be currently in that space and would be beneficiaries from that effort. And then we figure out how would we engage. And because my background is in banking, I look at wealth assets as a holistic approach. So we look at ways to achieve impact across a continuum. So you create a risk mitigated approach that has, on the one hand, traditional grants and philanthropy, and then you have venture philanthropy where you do a little more front-end funding, early stage funding for pilot programs, things that are a little bit riskier that you might be willing to say, you know what, it didn't work, but we had great learnings from it. And then you cross into moving toward the impact investment scale. So you look at social finance and investment, which is repayable social finance. So you could fund a charity for a capital expense, and then it's created as a loan that they can pay back so that money can be repurposed for an additional social impact in the future. And then you can look at various impact investment options. And so by doing that, you can get the whole family energized because you end up with something for everyone, but you create one ethos for giving that the family believes in. And so it helps to engage all the generations of people who have access to the wealth.
And from the professional's perspective, I suppose if you're working with a law firm who is doing an estate planning review with a client identifies philanthropy as something they're interested in, this can help them have that conversation without needing to have a detailed knowledge of what the latest trends are from the space, what all the options are. And I guess also from the wealth management side, there might be a wealth manager involved who is looking to manage the assets of the client, but is not necessarily familiar with all the different options that exist. Is that fair? You come in to give it an objective view.
Well, and the best outcomes come from a collaborative approach. And when you are thinking about next gen wealth, in the collaborative team approach, playing nicely in the sandbox with the whole team of trusted advisors is really attractive, because if you can imagine that you're sitting at the table with a family and they're talking about wanting to fund a project that they think they care about, they don't exactly know how to do it, it's really helpful if you can look at the family's wealth professionals and say, okay, is there going to be that much money? How would that be generated? Are you anticipating this in a one-time liquidity event where there's a whole bunch of money that we could put towards something? Or is this something that comes in annual bonuses and a bit gets hived off in a tax efficient way and used for impact? So having all the professionals at the table together, having a conversation, first of all, it's a lot better communication and things don't fall through the cracks. And the other thing is that for the other professional advisors who are looking to retain these families into the next generation, being part of these fun conversations, these are fun experiences. When they're part of it, it deepens their relationship with the clients. And so, there's no cross-selling because, I'm of no risk to someone. So if I'm brought in to sit at that table and have a conversation, it's win-win for the advisors who bring someone in. Because the younger generation really wants to know that if you're at the edge of your expertise, you have trusted advisors that you count on to bring into the conversation. And so by broadening the network of people who are associated with this family's wealth, everyone's relationships become deeper.
That's interesting. I mean, do you think that amongst the advisors that you deal with, the level of general knowledge and confidence to have these kind of conversations is improving? Is there any trend around that? I mean, I see as an outsider looking at the industry that there is certainly more volume of conversation and interest amongst the advisory community. Is that reflected in your experience?
What I would say is that if you are talking about ESG, and if you're talking about socially responsible investing, then I think it's becoming very mainstream. I think that that impact investing is right now a very, very broad topic. There is not a real common lexicon at this point for it. There's a lot of question about how do you measure impact? How do you, can you just look at the impact of one small thing under the umbrella of an organization that's doing other things, or does it all have to mitigate against each other to come up sort of a net impact? So all of that is still really in flux. What I find is that the discomfort in most instances for me is within the legal space, because lawyers by training are very, very careful about entering conversations where they don't have expertise. And so they are, I find, the most comfortable bringing someone in, because they'll say, I know up to this point, and this is the end of my expertise, and I wouldn't want to advise you further, but I'd be happy to make an introduction and join you in a conversation about this. And that's where I think that PCD and this type of a professional network is very valuable, because I think that there's real incentive to bring other people into the conversations and end up deepening your own knowledge just for the sake of understanding it more, but also giving you that one step away protection of not jumping into a conversation that you're uncomfortable with.
Okay, great. And so just to go into a little bit more detail, then looking at a values-based impact strategy, I mean, can you explain a little bit more about what it is and how it might benefit clients?
Sure, it's actually really fun. There's a gentleman named Quinn who was a professor at the University of Michigan in the US. And about 25 years ago, he noticed that in companies, there was a sense of sort of a core value system that companies held. And so what he did was create a framework, a values framework that had to do with your values when you engage with people, and how people tend to be attracted to people whose values mirror theirs. And so what I've done is take that approach that was used and it's used all over the world in corporate value systems. And I started looking at it from the perspective of a family. So I take every member of the family, multiple generations, children. I mean, I do it with 8 and 9-year-olds. And we go through this, and what it does is it puts you on a framework that helps me understand what makes you feel good. Because ultimately, when you create an impact strategy, the impact itself is all about the beneficiaries, right? It's about having a social improvement in the lives of others in some way. But whether or not it's truly successful is defined by the donor from the perspective of, did it feel really good? Did you achieve what you wanted to do? Were you able to help the vulnerable population or the environment or whatever it was that you chose to care about? And so by getting buy-in from all the members of the family, I'm able to create a strategy that will in some way speak to each of the members of the family based on what I'm able to glean from the values. So that's a really helpful way to start, and it makes it feel very bespoke.
And I guess the benefit there to the client is sort of self-evident. It's that you've set out some objectives, and then they can see the personal benefit based on what they've set out to achieve in the first place. It has got that measurability to it.
Well, and everybody gets an opportunity to put their stamp on it, so that you get consensus in a way that is, even when I've worked with younger children, children are remarkably interested in the world around them in a way that, when I was growing up, we weren't quite as in tune. And so if you, hive off a chunk of money on an annual basis and you say to young children, you have this money to give. Now I want you to go out and I want you to make a presentation for me, because they're all learning PowerPoint in school. And these children put together these amazing presentations based on, I help them learn how to research organizations and how to figure out, what are they doing and who are they helping. And all of a sudden, parents care about what their kids care about. Right? So you get all of this excitement and passion coming out of it, and that makes it incredibly fun. And so you're able to tweak it along the way, but your values driven the whole way.
So, I mean, there's obvious upside and advantages for the clients, but what do you find holds people back? Why aren't more clients implementing this kind of approach?
I think nearly every conversation I have at the very beginning is when someone says, I have no idea where to start. I don't think I'm ready for this because I have no idea where to start. And many times the reason that they haven't really thought about it is they either think they're just not sophisticated enough, and so they don't have the time to put into it to learn, or they say, I'm not wealthy enough. And so there's this sense that there's this arbitrary, invisible line somewhere drawn by someone else that says, you're not yet big enough. And I think that's the really sad thing, because to me, your impact assets that you can employ to use for this are, sure, your wealth is really important, but it's also your networks and connections and your skills. And that's where getting your children involved and thinking, they don't have the wealth to spend per se, but they may have great networks and connections when they're in their 20s and 30s and not yet have the wealth to give away. And their skills-based volunteering can be far more impactful to some organizations than the check you would be prepared to write. So looking at a family and saying, your strength right now is that you are the wealth holder. So that's great, let's do that. But then your children may be able to bring a completely different menu of skills and networks to this impact effort and be wildly successful because of what they can contribute. And that's a really attractive way to give everyone a part of the journey, no matter where they are in their own timeline.
And I'm guessing things sort of often start quite small and see how you're going from there. I mean, you can be dealing with a multimillionaire that's got, that's time poor, that has an interest in this, but would want to see, what kind of impact it can actually have. Do you find that people will dip their toe in the water, see what happens, and then build a bigger strategy off the positive feeling and feedback they get from that? It's not always about, a kind of a single line in the sand, a moment where they decide to commit, substantial capital to these kind of new strategy.
Absolutely. And I think, money isn't an identity, right? It's a tool. And so you have to decide, how am I going to learn how to use it? I mean, you're not born knowing how to use a hammer, right? Someone shows you, whatever skill it is, it takes time, and you have to make mistakes, and you have to hit your thumb, and you have to realize, that was really dumb. And so it's that journey where the expertise and the fun comes. But, recently I did a project with a client where, she's the daughter of a really, really well-known philanthropist in the US. And she is approaching her 70s. And she wanted to do something for there's a science museum. And, science museums are typically funded by school type funding measures because they offer learning opportunities for the schools to bring the students in. And she wanted to see how you could take a science museum and engage with an elderly population. And there were all kinds of issues with the elderly population being turned off by the kids screaming and running. And so I approached the organization on her behalf so that she could remain anonymous within the community while we were trying to figure out if this might work. And we were able to create an entire set of programming specifically for the elderly, with partners with other charities that work with community, with the council, with care homes, and they created a mobile science truck and all. And so it was a chance to try it and see what it would be like to do a completely bespoke programming. And the organization loved it because what we did was go to them and say, we're not going to tell you how to do it. We want you to tell us. If we handed you this money and we said, how could you do it? What would you do? And it gave them the license to do what they do best. And so it was win-win for everyone because they were able to do something they could never have otherwise afforded to do. And she was able to really leave a mark on something that she cared about. And it was a great start. And, who knows where that goes, but at least it leaves you with a positive sense that you can, invest your money for good and trust that the people you've given it to, will do their best with it.
And I guess for advisors, that's an easier way to start to look at tapping into things your client's interested in, looking at some modest projects, sharing that feeling with them, and then building from there. So it's sort of an experimentation also for those advisors who are recommending to clients to actually explore some of these routes.
Well, sure. Yeah. And anytime you are engaging with someone who doesn't have a product, I mean, someone like me in an advisory capacity, I can't sell you something. All I can do is, share my brain. That's what you're doing. And so, you have to prove that you're of value and that your interaction with this family is bringing added value. And so these opportunities are a chance for everyone to get a sense of each other, make sure that there's, a good sense of integrity and conversation and communication. And then, one that builds over time. And so, none of these changes, are built in a day or a week or a year. This kind of social change that people would like to be able to see, it takes a long time. And so you have to make sure you're on the journey with the right people.
And when you're working with families over this extended, period, you're helping them in terms of the difficult transition of wealth down the generations. That's a complex challenge for families to deal with. I mean, how do you support them on that journey?
Well, I think a big part of it is this values framework. It's part of what I think is so interesting about it. I had a family where the father and the daughter were both trained accountants, and the son was a lawyer. And we did this values thing, and the daughter and the father were extremely close, and the son was always the outlier. And we did this analysis, and then they all came together and we went through it. And I was discussing sort of what does it mean and why certain things are really valuable, to the son, but maybe not to the daughter. And the father looked at me and said, you have just explained every argument we've ever had since he was born. And, it's that kind of conversation across generations that makes people start to think, the person isn't just trying to argue with me for the sake of arguing with me. They really don't value this thing. This is what they care about. And all of a sudden they can look at the other members of their family from a different perspective. And so that in and of itself builds consensus. And those barriers to success are often communication driven and people making assumptions about other people based on what matters to them. And so as soon as you step back and you allow families to start to have some of these conversations, it's amazing how much they share so much more in what they care about than the differences. And the differences tend to be small things that are about how you would employ your assets or how you would engage with a beneficiary or an organization, not what you care about. And so I'm able to facilitate some really great conversations that move us toward a shared vision of what good would look like.
And when looking at the sort of wealth transfer, particularly of sort of the ultra high net worth clients, is sort of legacy part of this whole, the whole conversation is not just to look at the numbers which are going to devolve and flow down, the financial wealth that will flow down to the children, but what this if they're a wealth creator, what they've created in their lifetime, what that will mean in generations to come. I guess that's all part of the same conversation.
Well, it's really interesting because source of wealth goes a long way toward attitudes of wealth. If you look at someone who's inherited their wealth, They tend to have a much lower risk appetite because they certainly don't want to be seen as the generation that blew it, right? They tend to shepherd their wealth to the next generation. And but if you're looking at entrepreneurial wealth, so it's recent first or second generation wealth, they tend to have a different approach because it was their own horsepower that built it. And so the view oftentimes is that they have a very strong intentionality of taking those assets and using the vast bulk of them to achieve impact. And they have hived off a portion for their children that is enough to give them every opportunity, but not enough to make them fat and lazy. Because, there is a fear, I think, when you're self-made, there is a real fear that you've coddled your children and this whole wealth is going to be a disincentive. And so what's really interesting in those conversations is taking that next generation where the parents have been wildly successful and they've grown up in a situation that has been full of opportunity, and show them the responsibility of wealth by focusing on the impact assets. Because oftentimes the impact assets are sitting in a foundation or a donor advised fund or some other vehicle where the person can't take them and go buy a Ferrari. These are earmarked funds. And so because of that, we're able to work collectively on how to manage the responsibility of wealth. Because not only is it about not making a mistake where you send that money, there's also huge reputational management within these families and making sure that the ethos that has surrounded that family and the integrity of however it is that they have portrayed themselves in a public space continues in at least a positive way. They may take on a different personality as new family members take over, but this is an opportunity for them to learn and, make some mistakes, but keep the family image intact.
And just focusing in on the next gen and their attitudes. I mean, are there any sort of meta trends, or they could be regarded as generalizations about that next generations of millennials coming through and their attitudes towards wealth, values, and impact? What's your perspective on that?
Well, it's funny enough, I've spoken a lot about this in the last 6 months. For some reason, it has just been, a conversation that I keep getting invited to be part of. And I'm going to give a strange analogy, so just follow me on this. So I believe that you can compare millennials to beach glass. So beach glass is a piece of glass that has external forces impact it over time. So you've got the sun, you've got the water, the sand, the salt, and at the end, when it ends up on the beach, it is wholly changed from its original starting point, right? It's been etched, it's been softened, the edges are rounded. So I would argue that those forces in the millennial generation are failure of institutions, failure of people who have been put in positions of power, a change in pedagogy, and the introduction of video games. And so the institutions and the people in positions of power are pretty obvious over the last 20 years. You look at the financial crisis, you look at governments, you look at the fact that there's just conflict everywhere. So this is what they've grown up in. So that part's easier to understand. But if you think about the pedagogy piece, so pedagogy is the study of teaching. And if you go back 25 years or so, it really shifted in schools. It's all team-based, it's team taught, it's team learning. It's all about collective ideas. It's the sort of rising tide lifting all the ship. And students are being taught to be risk takers in their learning, right? When I was growing up, there was a wrong answer. If you got it wrong, it was wrong. Well, this group, they grew up with the idea of partial credit. If you think you know that problem, just do the work for it. And, we might be able to give you a partial credit on that math problem. Or write that essay and we'll see what you knew. And so they're not afraid to just stick their neck out and throw out an idea. And that's a really big piece of what's happening in this generation. And the last piece is video games, which I know sounds strange, but think about it. If you get in a video game, and you're supposed to go from level to level to level, and you go down a hallway and you run into a wall and you blow up, you just turn it off and start again. And then you do it and you learn. And you don't go left the next time. Next time you go right. And then you go to the next level. And that infuses all their thinking, because they're forever saying, well, fine, I'll start over. I'll start over my career. I'll make an abrupt left-hand turn. I will, they adopt these methods. And so what's happened is those 4 things have changed them. So as far as, when you talk about meta trends, what would I say? I would say that millennials demand transparency and trust because they have seen people behave badly who have been put into positions of authority. They don't necessarily see great hierarchy in management structures as a benefit. They feel that they should have the right to contribute to the conversation, whether they are new in the organization or not, because that's what they've been taught in school. Your voice is valuable, sit here, join the conversation. So they do, and they want to be heard. And that's fair. They also really like the idea of exerting their power and influence. And it's exerted in interesting ways. It's in purchasing power. It's in social media. They will name and shame. They will call out hypocrisy. Even in dietary choices. They are showing their values and their beliefs in all aspects. And I was speaking to a panel for a law firm not long ago, and I was talking about the balance of work-life balance and how the values are integrated into everything. And this young man said, well, then you don't understand, because it's not about work-life balance. It's not binary for us. It's integrated all the time. And so when you're dealing with multiple generations in a family, you can imagine how a 75-year-old wealth-holding grandparent is looking at this generation and shaking their head. But when you can start to look at the values are all still there. It's just showing in different ways. And so this need to collaborate and have a team approach and not be siloed is really important. And it can be really celebrated if it's introduced in the right way.
That's interesting. Given that the older generations and the millennials are viewing the world in quite fundamentally different ways, do you find it's a challenge to kind of create common ground between the two parties? For those who are part of a family with inherited wealth, I guess the parental generation may have only been passed the reins relatively recently. They were treated in a certain way by their parents. So it might be there's a tension there between really being very inclusive with the next generation coming through, depending on the way they have also been treated in the family business, or the family wealth. What do you find on that creation of common ground in lots of different circumstances?
Well, I think culturally speaking, in the UK, conversations about wealth and the transfer of wealth are kept very close to the vest. It's just, in the US, you see a lot more conversation at a lot earlier age, because wealth isn't as taboo a subject as I find it to be here. I think that it depends on if the parents have taken assets under their control in a relatively recent way, then I think the world has changed in that wealth is seen in many cases as not something to aspire to, right? All of a sudden, wealth is being looked at very critically, and families are in a position where in some ways it's like they can't win no matter what they do. If they decide to be philanthropic, they're judged for having either not been philanthropic enough or not choosing the right thing to be philanthropic with. And if they, drive a lovely car, then they're judged for being, it's a no-win situation. And that's relatively new, because in previous eras, people looked at them as a success story, as something to emulate. And so I think that the generation that is next gen, what everyone's referring to as next gen, they're a little uncomfortable with wealth. And so having these conversations is important to them because they feel like to whom much is given, much is expected. And they plan to use this wealth to build back better, to be involved with impact, to make a difference. And so I think those conversations are happening in families. And so I do think that there will be a greater shift with the generation that's currently holding the money, that may be these young people's parents, because they're seeing the whole paradigm is shifting. And, you know, the more that the advisors talk to their clients, especially lawyers when they're doing the estate planning, the more they talk to their clients about learning and conversations about the people who will inherit, the better those transitions are. And it's a wonderful way for relationships between the advisors to build with the next gen, because it brings them into the tent to have adult conversations. And, you know, it helps to fight that risk that you have, you know, 90% of people who inherit the assets change their advisor within 90 days. That's a big deal. And so if you're trying to keep assets and families under your, management, then you really do need to make sure that when you're engaging with the wealth holder, you're also making yourself relevant to the next generation wealth holder.
Okay, thank you for that. And just as we finish off the conversation here, I mean, you're an impact advisor with Acorn Capital. Why don't you tell us a little bit more about Acorn?
Well, Acorn Capital Advisors is, there are three of us who are working together. Sally Tennant, who has a history of having been CEO at various UK private banks, and then Diane, and she has a background in investments and CIO. And so because my background was in banking, and they were finding a gap in services for family offices, and they were approaching it from the perspective of having people with technical knowledge and experience, as opposed to just general advisors, to come in and say, you know, we can design and build a family office alongside your attorneys. We can help your trustees evaluate an existing family office. We can look at the investment strategies and see, you know, have they worked? Are they fitting with what your goals are? And then they realize that there's this whole impact piece. And so it really nicely dovetailed, because my approach is very much an asset allocation approach. And so we were able to complement our approaches to wealth management and look at a family in its entirety alongside its other trusted advisors. So we can come in and not displace the people who are currently working with the family, but just supplement the skills to lift the family office to a higher performance level across the board, whether it's governance, investment, or impact. And it's really exciting because there's a lot of work to be done, a lot of new family offices. And, you know, there was a report recently from UBS Global Family that said, you know, a third of family offices have no succession plan. That's a big deal. I mean, it's a really big deal, because it's, you know, it's that whole axiom of, you know, shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations, right? So it exists because it happens so often. And, you know, we all advise wealthy families, and the best thing to advise them to do is to be planning, because, you know, the wealth slips away and all of these great intentions are gone. So, being in their corner and supporting them is a really important part of ensuring that their wealth is preserved and augmented over time.
Brilliant. Well, look, great to talk to you today. Look forward to sharing this with our members. So thanks for speaking to me today.
Thank you for having me.